Have you ever paused to ask yourself, are you truly in control of this life? Or are you simply repeating familiar thoughts, making decisions that seem right, and calling your emotional reactions natural without ever once observing them? Carl Gustav Jung looked directly at an uncomfortable truth. The greatest danger to our inner life does not lie in external forces, but in the unconscious within us. For when you do not recognize what is controlling you, you give it a more comforting name: freedom. This video was not created to teach you what to think, what to believe, or to force you to change yourself immediately. It was created to place a small crack in the illusion that says, I am in control. And sometimes, a single crack is enough to let the light in. If you have ever felt exhausted without knowing why, if you have ever reacted in ways that surprised even yourself, if you have ever lived very busy, yet felt strangely distant from who you are, stay. Because in the very moment you begin to observe rather than resist, a deeper form of freedom may be quietly emerging. Most of us enter life carrying a silent yet solid belief. I am the one at the wheel. I think what I think because these are my thoughts. I choose as I choose because I want to. I am sad. I am angry. I am joyful. Because emotions naturally arise, like changes in the weather. This belief gives us a subtle sense of safety, that life, however complex, still remains within our control. Yet according to Carl Gustav Jung, this very sense of safety is often the most sophisticated mask of the unconscious. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This statement is not meant to deny human will, but to expose a difficult paradox. Many things we call free decisions are, in truth, reactions programmed long ago. They are shaped by memory, trauma, family patterns, culture, and experiences that were never fully illuminated. When these forces operate in the dark, we do not feel controlled. On the contrary, everything appears perfectly reasonable. Loss of control rarely arrives as a collapse. It is not loud or dramatic. It comes through very small things. A familiar thought repeating itself, an emotional reaction that appears too quickly, a decision made out of habit. Jung called this a life guided by complexes, psychological knots charged with emotional energy that influence perception without the permission of consciousness. And because they operate slowly and steadily, we fail to notice that we are gradually trading awareness for familiarity. What is frightening is not that we do not fully control our lives. No one ever does. What is more unsettling is believing we are in control while never observing how our thoughts, decisions, and emotions are formed. In that state, the unconscious does not need to force anything. It simply continues its quiet work. And we, in complete sincerity, call its outcomes personality, or say, "That's just the way I am." Jung does not invite us to doubt everything or to distrust ourselves in a pathological way. He asks only a gentle question, one with the power to deeply unsettle. Is the life you are living truly chosen, or merely repeated? For the moment you begin to see your inner processes, even faintly, is the moment the illusion of control begins to crack. And through that crack, what emerges is not chaos, but another possibility. The possibility of living more consciously, more slowly, and more honestly with yourself. And when the illusion that we are in control begins to tremble, a subtler question emerges. If it was not brute force that took our freedom away, then what caused it to fade, without us ever noticing? We often tell ourselves a very cinematic story about manipulation. In that story, there is always a clear villain, an obvious scheme, a decisive moment when control is violently taken from our hands. This way of imagining manipulation comforts us, Because if manipulation always appeared so dramatically, we believe we would recognize it and resist in time. But Carl Gustav Jung saw something far more subtle. The most dangerous forms of influence rarely appear as threats. They appear as what is familiar. Effective manipulation does not need to give orders. It does not need to persuade through argument. It only needs to repeat itself long enough for something to begin to feel normal. And once the abnormal becomes normal, the mind stops asking questions. Jung warned that humanity's greatest disaster does not lie in a lack of knowledge, but in living without realizing that one is being guided. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When an influence operates in the unconscious, it does not feel imposed. On the contrary, it feels entirely natural, as if it were your own thought. What makes this kind of manipulation frightening is not its intensity, but its gentleness. It whispers. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand that you change your beliefs overnight. It merely adjusts, little by little, the boundaries of what feels acceptable. Each time you ignore a subtle discomfort, each time you tell yourself, "Everyone lives like this," each time you choose silence in exchange for temporary peace. These small choices, accumulated over time, construct the reality you are living in, even though you never consciously chose it. Jung understood that the human mind instinctively avoids inner tension. It would rather adapt to a distorted reality than face the unease of questioning it. And it is precisely here that manipulation reaches its highest form, when no one needs to control you anymore, because you have already adjusted yourself to fit. At that point, the ego does not feel invaded. It feels safe. But Jung did not offer this warning to instill fear. He offered it as an invitation to awaken. Because the moment you begin to realize that what feels natural within you may not be entirely your own, you create a small opening in the wall of the unconscious. And within that opening, a new possibility appears. The possibility of choosing again, not through loud rebellion, but through quiet, conscious presence. And when manipulation no longer needs to hide, when it has dissolved into what we call normal, the next question is no longer who is controlling us, but how the mind allows it to happen. The human mind was not designed to question everything. If every thought and every action had to pass through careful analysis, we would quickly become exhausted. So, in order to survive, the mind learns to conserve energy. It creates invisible shortcuts, familiar patterns, repeating rhythms that allow life to flow without requiring constant conscious effort. Carl Gustav Jung saw in this mechanism both the intelligence of nature and the most vulnerable point of the human psyche. When something is repeated long enough, the mind stops asking why. Instead, it asks a far simpler question. Is this familiar? And if the answer is yes, the mind lowers its guard. Familiarity brings a sense of safety, and safety is easily mistaken for truth. Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Avoidance does not always look like running away. Sometimes it simply looks like drifting along with what is already known." From Jung's perspective, belief is not always built upon truth, but very often upon the feeling of having lived with something for a long time. Ideas, viewpoints, emotional reactions that are repeated again and again gradually become part of the ego, even if they were never consciously chosen. We do not believe them because they are true, but because they are familiar. And it is precisely here that control begins to operate at its deepest level. No coercion, no persuasion. Only enough comfort to prevent questioning. What is worth reflecting on is this. The mind does not feel controlled when it follows familiarity. On the contrary, it feels efficient. Jung described this state as a life shaped by the collective unconscious and psychological patterns. He emphasized, the unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. For this reason, the problem is not the existence of the unconscious, but whether we recognize its influence. When control is exercised through comfort, it becomes invisible. There is no tension to resist, no conflict to awaken us, only a smooth current of mental habits quietly carrying us away from genuine choice. And Jung would not tell you to destroy all patterns or to live in constant doubt. He offered something far more subtle. The moment you begin to question what has become too familiar, you are restoring a small but essential part of your inner freedom. And when familiarity becomes strong enough to replace questioning, the mind no longer needs to be guided. It naturally gravitates toward whatever feels most comfortable. Carl Gustav Jung observed the human being with a gaze that was both piercing and compassionate. The human psyche does not truly long for truth as much as it longs for equilibrium. Truth, more often than not, carries conflict. It demands that we see the contradictions within ourselves, that we admit the possibility that what we believe, what we do, and what we have become may not be entirely the result of conscious choice. Faced with that prospect, the mind does not respond with courage, but with a more refined survival strategy: avoidance. When reality produces discomfort, the mind rarely chooses direct confrontation. Instead, it adjusts perception, not through blatant lies, but through small, highly reasonable, very adult stories. That's just the way things are. Everyone thinks like this. There's nothing to question. These statements do not appear as part of a conspiracy. They appear as self-reassurance. Jung understood that it is precisely in these moments of self-reassurance that the ego begins to trade awareness for a sense of calm. Jung wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. Disturbance sets it in motion." The psyche is always seeking to return to the least tense state possible, and when a particular truth threatens inner balance, the mind does not rush to reject that truth. It simply renders it vague. This vagueness is not painful. On the contrary, it brings relief. And for that reason, it is rarely resisted. Over time, the ego gradually accepts a version of reality it never truly chose. There is no decisive moment, no silent vow, only a gentle, continuous drift of inherited beliefs. Jung called this state unconscious identification, when we identify with psychological patterns without realizing it. He warned, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because such acceptance cannot occur if we continue telling ourselves stories in order to avoid confrontation." What is striking is this: the ego does not feel persuaded, it feels reasonable. And for that very reason, questioning begins to seem unnecessary. Why disturb the surface when everything appears calm? Why dig deeper when surface answers are sufficient to get through the day? Jung saw here a painful paradox. Human beings are willing to abandon their deeper truth simply to preserve a temporary sense of stability. But Jung did not view this avoidance as a moral failure. He saw it as a natural mechanism. The problem is not that the mind seeks balance. That is necessary for survival. The problem lies in this: when balance is maintained by distorting perception, the price paid is inner growth. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Consciousness always requires a certain degree of unease. And when we refuse that unease, we also refuse the opportunity to understand ourselves more deeply. The stories the mind tells are not always false. They are simply incomplete, and the danger lies here. The ego rarely knows that it is living inside an edited story. We continue to love, to hate, to choose, to react, but based on a flattened map of reality. There are no sharp peaks of truth, no deep valleys of questioning, only a safe surface on which to move. Jung called the process of breaking this false safety individuation. It is not about becoming different from others, but about becoming more honest with what is happening within. And this process always begins with a very small moment, the moment we realize how many things we have accepted simply because everyone thinks so. Jung reminded us, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When darkness is brought into the light, the old balance is disturbed. But this is not destruction, it is reorganization. A new form of balance, deeper, more flexible, begins to take shape, no longer grounded in self-soothing stories, but in conscious presence. And from Jung's perspective, it is only then that the ego truly begins to live its own life, rather than inhabiting a version of reality that was chosen on its behalf long ago. And when the ego has grown accustomed to living inside stories that help it maintain balance, what follows is not an obvious loss, but a silent adaptation. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit room. At first, you immediately notice the lack of light. There is slight discomfort, a certain alertness. You know you cannot see clearly. But then time passes. Your eyes adjust. Shapes slowly emerge, just enough for you to move around. And before long, you stop thinking about the light altogether. Not because the light has returned, but because you have adapted to its absence. Carl Gustav Jung saw in this simple image a precise metaphor for how the human mind loses freedom without ever realizing it. Nothing is taken away violently. No door slams shut. There is no dramatic moment you can point to and say, "That is when I lost control." Everything still appears to be there. You still think. You still choose. You still feel as though you are living your own life. And precisely because of this, the change becomes difficult to detect. Jung once wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. What is not lived, not seen, not made conscious. This is what quietly shapes the entire psychological atmosphere. This is how the mind adapts. When a certain level of limitation persists long enough, it is no longer experienced as a limitation. It becomes normal. And when imperfection becomes normal, the ego loses the impulse to question. Jung understood that the most effective form of control does not resemble a cage, because a cage has bars you can recognize. It resembles a room that is bright enough to live in, yet dim enough that you cannot see what has been lost. In this context, familiarity is not merely comfort. It is a lullaby. It tells the mind that everything is fine. And the mind, always seeking stability, is willing to believe it. Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Adaptation is not always a sign of strength. Sometimes it is simply the most refined way of avoiding confrontation. What is worth reflecting on is this. When the light fades gradually, we retain no clear memory of it ever having been brighter. We only know that this present state is what we have grown used to. And so we build our entire value system, our aspirations, and our limits based on the level of light currently available. Jung called this a life governed by the unconscious, not because the unconscious imposes itself, but because consciousness has stopped questioning. He wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. But when it is not illuminated, it operates by inertia rather than by truth. Control in this situation does not feel like imprisonment. It feels reasonable. It whispers, 'You are safe.' And safety, for the mind, often matters more than freedom. Safety does not demand change. It does not demand risk. It does not demand admitting that perhaps one has been living under weaker light than necessary. Jung understood that the most dangerous moment is not when human beings suffer, but when they adapt to a lower level of inner life without feeling pain. Not because the ego has been persuaded by argument, not because someone proved that dim light is sufficient, but because questioning itself begins to feel unnecessary. Once you are accustomed to seeing everything in that light, questioning the light only threatens the stability you have achieved, and so the ego chooses silence. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." This statement speaks not only of generations, but of ourselves. The unlived parts of life continue to exist in the shadows, shaping the present without our awareness. Jung did not regard this adaptation as a sin. He saw it as a stage most human beings must pass through. But he also emphasized this: psychological growth begins only when we recognize what we have adapted to, when we remember, however faintly, that the light was once brighter. Not to indulge in regret, but to ask again, what level of light am I living in? Individuation, in Jung's view, is not about destroying the room or shattering familiarity. It is about gradually increasing the light, and that light does not come from outside, but from a simple yet courageous act, returning to the things we stopped questioning. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When darkness is made conscious, the light does not need to be blinding. It only needs to be sufficient to reveal what has been forgotten. And in that moment, control loses its power, not because we fight it, but because we no longer confuse familiarity with freedom. And when we have grown accustomed to living in dim light, no longer remembering how radiant it once was, the question is no longer who is controlling us, but why we have accepted this state as something natural." The Stoics understood this very early, with a clarity that was both austere and deeply humane. Freedom does not disappear when chains appear, but when the capacity for inner observation weakens. Epictetus, who once lived as a slave, became one of the most powerful voices on inner freedom. He wrote, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." This sentence is not merely moral consolation. It is an exact diagnosis of how freedom is lost. We are not bound by circumstances, but by judgments we accept without examination. Carl Gustav Jung, from a different tradition, touched the same blind spot. He recognized that much of human psychological life is governed by evaluations that have never been brought into awareness. These judgments do not arrive as conscious choices. They are inherited from family, culture, religion, the spirit of the age. They are repeated long enough to become self-evident, and then they are absorbed so quietly that we mistake them for our own voice. Jung wrote, "We are shaped by our unconscious, and we call it fate." When judgments operate in the dark, we do not feel coerced. We feel that we are reacting appropriately. The danger does not lie in the content of the judgments, but in the fact that they are never questioned. We believe there are things everyone knows. Emotions, one naturally should have. Reactions that need no explanation. And it is precisely this self-evidence that numbs freedom. For if a judgment is never brought into the light, it will continue to govern emotions, decisions, and the direction of one's life, without the consent of consciousness. Jung and the Stoics meet at a crucial point. Freedom is a skill of attention. It does not come from changing the external world, but from observing what is happening within before we react. Epictetus emphasized distinguishing between what lies within our control and what does not. Jung went one step further. He showed that many things we believe to be my choice are in fact my habit. And habit, when unrecognized, becomes the most comfortable chain of all. What is absorbed quietly rarely feels foreign. On the contrary, It feels familiar, like an old house. We enter it without turning on the lights because we have grown used to the darkness. Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Avoidance does not need to be dramatic. Sometimes, it simply means continuing to live with old judgments because they spare us the unease of looking again. In the Stoic spirit, freedom begins when we pause between stimulus and response. In the Jungian spirit, a deeper freedom begins when we ask, where does this reaction come from? From which fear? Which memory? Which pattern? Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This line echoes like a modern Stoic reminder. If judgments are not illuminated, we will continue to live by them and call it destiny. What is worth reflecting on is this. We do not need to eliminate all judgments to be free. Neither Epictetus nor Jung demanded the impossible. They invited a different posture, examination. Examination is not self-condemnation. It is the restoration of choice. When a judgment is seen, it loses its absolute power. It becomes a possibility, not a command. Freedom, in this sense, is not a state achieved once and for all. It is an ongoing practice of awareness. It requires accepting that many things that feel familiar may not be true, and many things that feel safe may not be free. Jung called this process individuation, not becoming someone else, but becoming someone who is genuinely present with their inner life. When judgments are brought into the light, we do not need to fight them. We only need to see them. And in that moment of seeing, the chains no longer need to be broken, because we realize that we have not truly been gripping them for a very long time. And when the judgments that once quietly governed life have been seen, even if only for a fleeting moment, the final question is no longer how to reclaim control, but whether we can stop forcing ourselves. So tonight, there is nothing you need to fix. No self that must be re-engineered. No moral lesson to memorize in order to become better. Carl Gustav Jung never regarded awakening as a tense project of self-improvement. On the contrary, he saw in the endless effort to fix oneself a subtle form of resistance, a resistance to sitting still and observing what already is. Jung wrote, "What you resist persists. Whatever is forced to change before it is understood will only find a way to return in another form. There is no enemy to confront, because most of what has shaped you did not arise from malice. It arose from adaptation, from the wish to feel safe, from the need for inner balance. And so awakening is not a battle. It does not require strain. It does not require iron will. It requires something entirely different: gentle recognition." Jung understood that the unconscious does not open under pressure. It reveals itself only when met with patience and non-judgment. If control can be lost without violence, without imprisonment, without coercion, then perhaps freedom does not require fighting either. Perhaps freedom begins in the moment we realize how long we have lived within familiar patterns without ever asking, where did this come from? Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." To recognize is not to overthrow fate, but to see the invisible hand that has been guiding us. And this recognition does not need to happen now. This is where Jung differs from many traditions that demand immediate awakening. He did not require a sudden illumination. He understood that the mind needs time to absorb truth without defending itself. Recognition can wait until tomorrow, or the day after, or some moment when you are quiet enough to listen to the smallest movements within. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But he also knew that this pain need not be forced. It arrives in its own time, when we are ready. For now, let the mind rest. Rest is not avoidance. Rest is the creation of space for the unconscious to continue its work of arranging, connecting, and healing in its own way. Jung believed that sleep is not an interruption of consciousness, but another phase of psychological life. In sleep, what cannot yet be understood by reason may begin to be felt through images, emotions, and symbols. This is not surrender. This is trust in the inner process. Jung called this process individuation, the path of becoming oneself, not by adding more, but by gradually removing false identifications. And this path is never walked by force. It is walked through gentle attention to what has long been overlooked. At the next level, we will not seek answers from the outer world. Jung understood that the deepest doubt does not come from questioning others, but from beginning to question what we once considered self-evident. When doubt is seeded from within, it does not destroy the mind. It makes the mind more alive, but not tonight. Tonight, nothing more needs to be understood. Nothing needs to be remembered. Nothing needs to be changed. Simply allow one small thought to remain. Perhaps I do not need to fight in order to awaken. And if that thought is light enough, it will not keep you awake. It will follow you into sleep, like a whisper from the unconscious that is beginning to be heard. Sleep now. The deeper work is still continuing.